Já, góðan daginn, kæru gestir og líka þeir sem eru hérna handan við vegginn. Ég býð ykkur líka velkomin. Það gleður mig að sjá okkur öll hér í sal Þjóðminjasafnsins á þessum fyrirlestri sem í boði öndvegisverkefnisins heimsins hnoss, söfn efnismenningar, menningararfleif og merking. Þessi viðburður hefur verið skipulagður af fjórða þræði rannsóknarverkefnisins sem snýr að kennilegri efnismenningarfræði og fornleifafræði. Fyrir áramót var svipaður viðburður á dagskrá öndvegisverkefnisins sem var þriðja þráðar verkefnisins, safnafræði þráðurinn. Hann stóð að svipuðum viðburði og í haust mun annar þráður verkefnisins, saga og merking hluta, standa að sambærilegum viðburði. Þetta eru viðburðir sem fela í sér eins konar strandhögg og með tilvísan í enska hugtakið strand eða það að segja þráður og jafnframt með hliðsjón af því að með þessum viðburðum gerum við einhvers konar strandhögg í erlendar menntastofnanir og nemum þaðan reyndar með mjög kurteislegu heimboði til landsins fræðimenn sem sinna rannsóknum sem á einn eða annan hátt snert á þau rannsóknarsvið sem við erum að vinna á. Og fjórði þráður öndvegisverkefnisins, heimsins hnoss, hjóð þannig strandhögg á austurströnd Bandaríkjanna en heiðursgestur þráðarins í dag og öndvegisverkefnisins Jane Bennett, Andrew V. Mellon, professor í hugvísindum við John Hopkins háskólann í Baltimore. Jane Bennett, sem stjórnmálafræðingur í grunninn, hefur á undanförnum árum, já, kannski síðastliðin 20 ári það minnsta, vakið töluverða athygli fyrir skrif sín, einkum og sér í lagi líflega efnishyggju, þar sem hún lýsir líflegum tengslanetum sem virka bæði óháð og ásamtínu mennska og í bók sinni Vibrant Matter, A Political Ecology of Things segir Bennett að markmið hennar sé að leitast við að lýsa líflegum efnisveruleika, það sem hún kallar vibrant materiality, sem rekur samhlið á innan hins mennska, svo að rannsaka megi hvaða breytingum pólitískt ástand tæki ef við virtum áhrifavald hluta. Og þannig hefur Jane Bennett skipað sér lið fjölmargra fræðimanna þvert á hug- og félagsvísindi sem kallað hafa eftir aukinni athygli til handa hlutum, áhrifamætti þeirra og stöðu hluta innan hins mennska. Og hún hefur þannig á þennan hátt með fræðimennsku sinni haft áhrif á orðræðuna innan fjölmargra greina, hug- og félagsvísinda og langt út fyrir hinn hefðbundnu mörk sinna eigin fræðagreinar, það að segja stjórnmálafræðinar. En áður en ég býð Jane Bennett hér upp á púltinu langar mig að minnast á framhald þessa viðburðar, það að segja málstofu sem mun fara fram hér í þessum sal, hér í sal Þjóðminjasafnsins á morgun, föstudag, frá klukkan 10 og til 3, málstofunni sem við höfum gefið titilinn Hlutir á reki, söfn efnismenningar, verður reyndar skipt upp í 2 hluta, sá fyrri stendur yfir frá 10 til cirka 11:30 og svo verður seinni hlutinn frá 13:30 til klukkan 3 eða til 15. Og á málstofunni sem Jane Bennett mun taka þátt í munu 6 fræðimenn sem tengjast öndvegisverkefninu á einn eða annan hátt ræða efnismenningarfræði frá mismunandi sjónarhornum. Það verða Ágústa Edvald, Finnur Jónasson, Anna Heiða Baldursdóttir, Þóra Pétursdóttir, Gavin Lukas og svo Björnar Olsen, prófessor í fornleifafræði við Tromsø háskóla. Hann einmitt hluti hóps erlendra sérfræðinga sem tengjast þessu öndvegisverkefni og munu heimsækja okkur reglulega í tengslum við viðburði eins og þennan og fylgja verkefninu eftir á næstu árum. En þá ekki annað að gera en að bjóða Jane Bennett hér upp á pontunni og ég skipti þá yfir á ensku. Professor Jane Bennett, I am honored to invite you here to take us out for a walk. And now, this is your moment.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be here in Reykjavik at the National Museum of Iceland and to be engaged in conversations with the members of my Favorite Things group, research group. I'm grateful to Dr. Magnuson and Drs. Magnuson and now I hesitate about the pronunciation, Thora, Pietotur, for the invitation and for their generous hospitality, and thank you all for coming. Okay. First, I'll just say that this was a photograph that I took when I was in Germany a couple of years ago, and then when I was looking for a slide, for the first slide, I realized that was the perfect slide because there's a little person across the field taking a walk. All right. In a recent essay called Theory Adrift, Pétursdóttir and Olsen suggest that examples are not, quote, secondary to theory, but a constructive and an integral part of it. One is neither on top of the other nor extracted from the other, they write. The examples amidst my theorizing talk today are walks, one taken by the naturalist Henry Thoreau in New England on July 23rd in 1851, and a few others taken this December and January in Baltimore by some graphic lines as they wind their way into doodles. So I will thank you in advance for looking at my artwork. It's like my debut as an artwork. My doodles will be featured. That lines to take walks is what the artist Paul Klee said in this famous line, quote, an active line moving freely goes for a stroll on its own without destination. A walk, to again use the vocabulary of the Theory Adrift essay, is a morphology in which various elements form messy assemblages. Many in this room may already live with the thought that their own agency, human agency, is in truth an admixture of human and non-human tendencies and efforts. One can live, think, or intend, for example, only by way of help, by gravitational and climatic forces, a gut microbiome, and the mineral agencies of iron in blood and calcium in bones, not to mention a wide variety of techno-affordances, ranging from fire to eyeglasses to antibiotics. Many in this room may also have noticed how hard it is to bespeak such a compositional kind of agency. I'm not sure if agency is the right word. I've been experimenting with different concepts. Agency, operativity, vitality, efficacy. But the point I want to make now is it's very hard to talk about a compositional kind of efficacy in a language whose subject-predicate grammar resists it so stubbornly. That is why in the second part of my talk today, after my stories about walks, I'm going to turn to questions of rhetoric, to practices of writing that might push back against the anthropocentric grammar of the language I know best, which is modern English. Taking a term from the poet Walt Whitman, a contemporary of Thoreau's, I think of the stories I'm going to tell about walks as dotings. To dote is like you dote over a baby or you dote over something that requires careful attention. But he used the verb to dote more expansively. And to mean to dote is to practice a perceptual style receptive to something like what Hans Ulrich Gombrich called the presence effects of things. Doting is, maybe you could think of it as slow sensing, as in this passage from Whitman's 1855 poem, Song of Myself. Yeah, I dote on myself. There's a lot of me and all so luscious. Each moment and whatever happens thrills me with joy. I cannot tell how my ankles bend, nor whence the cause of my faintest wish, nor the cause of the friendship I admit, nor the cause of the friendship I take again. That I walk up my stoop, I pause to consider if it really be. A morning glory at my window satisfies me more than the metaphysics of books. And stoop is just the steps up, you know. Now, Whitman begins by doting on his self, but in his poetry, the I, the self, that is the one he plays with, is progressively dispersed into a teeming atmosphere, into what he calls an electric cosmos, whose consistency includes the things on that list, but also includes many, that list is one of many of a catalog of lists that appear in the poetry. So the dote, the object of doting, it can be oneself, then it moves to your ankles, then to your wishes, but it's also to pretty much everything. This is just one of a characteristic list of Whitman, where he names many things that he comes across. You can kind of see here it moves from the blab of the pavement to carts, to the sounds of snow sleighs, to people moaning in sickness, to an excited crowd, to impassive stones, groans, exclamations of women giving birth. And then the last line is the one I want to emphasize, what living and buried speech is always vibrating here. So that's the kind of mood in which I'm going to be entering when I tell my stories of walks. Okay. So pave and promenader, clinks and jokes, metal badge and excited crowd. Each of these for Whitman speaks or has a kind of presence. Whitman's poetry resonates with that of British Romanticism, but whereas romantic doting humanizes individual figures and tends to light them up as moral subjects, Whitman's doting dismantles individuals into processual assemblages of material relations and historical forces. That's a whole other topic it's not the topic of this talk, but the way that Whitman uses language to do that has been very inspirational for me. So to dote on presence effects is to be able to feel more of the inscriptive impress of ahuman elements. Just one more sort of philosophical concept before I move on to the discussion of the walks. Another useful concept for me, or figure of speech, is what the media philosopher Lorenz Engel calls ontography. Ontography names a trans-species capacity to inscribe upon the surface of a body, doing so without recourse to language or perhaps even concepts. So not or not quite human things, such as a landscape or a breeze or a fragment of paper from an abandoned herring processing plant, these could be said to perform ontographic operations upon the human walker or the human archaeologist. So sort of the way it inscribes something on the presence of your body so that you feel a little bit different. This operation can later be written up or translated into human words, and again, the question of a poetics appropriate for such a translation is going to be the focus of the second half of my talk. Okay, but let's go to the walks. Let's see. All right. First, Thoreau's summer walk on July 23rd, 1851. There's a lot of interesting sort of physiological research on the practice of walking. And my favorite definition of walking is, quote, a forward-leaning process in which we almost but not quite fall down repeatedly. Right? Walking, of course, is good for your health. It's good for your lungs. And as an old peripatetic tradition attests, it's also good for philosophizing or theorizing. In Plato, he has his character Phaedrus say this to Socrates, and to the cicadas, the small insects. Let us walk along the Ilissus River as we talk. That's how the Platonic dialogue begins. Rousseau says, my mind only works with my legs. And Thoreau, too, extolled walking, or to be more precise, a particularly unhurried, undirected version of walking he called sauntering. And here's a famous line from his famous essay, famous to some people, I suppose, Walking, right? And he likes to play with words, and he takes the idea of sauntering from the notion of idle people who roved around the country and asked for charity under the pretense of going à la Sainte-Terre to the Holy Land. Okay. Now, sauntering, like Paul Clay's strolling, has a certain vector quality, a directionality. Right? It's heading, but not necessarily heading somewhere. Right? The line is not, this little vector quality or directionality is not necessarily uniform or straight. Rather, what Thoreau and Clay highlight is a linear propensity for meandering. So it's a weird kind of linearity that meanders. Okay. That's my meander, a meandering line. Okay, now, Thoreau's specific walk in Massachusetts on July 23rd, 1851. That day, Thoreau was startled by a feeling, he says, of being, so he's out for a walk. He always takes walks every day. He goes out for a walk, and on that particular day, for reasons he doesn't understand at all, he feels weighted down, pressed down by the atmosphere, and it's 15 pounds per square inch of atmospheric pressure. So that's what he notices. You might call it barometric pressure. Now, on days with more comfortable weather, and this is his phrase, he feels stupendous piles of light ethereal influence. Stupendous piles of light ethereal influence, right? On normal days, he wouldn't even notice that. We don't notice it in the room, but there's 15 pounds per square inch weighing down on us even now. On normal days, he wouldn't notice it, but it's a hot and sticky day in Massachusetts, and the atmosphere chose that day to announce itself as an active force and refuses the status of a background condition. The atmosphere imprints itself on Thoreau's body in a rather dramatic fashion, in what one could say an ontographic operation that, as we later learn from his journal, redistributes the relative strengths of his faculties. What happens, and I'll show you the quotation in a moment. Here's the journal quotation. Oh, well, I'll get to that. Yeah, that's a different one. What happens on that day, he says, is that his faculties get discombobulated. His faculty of thought, his capacity to organize experience into ideas, words, categories, phrases, that capacity, he says, is drowned. He's outside feeling the weight of the pressure. He can't think. One could say it's just too hot to think. So there's too hot to think, the illustration. At the very same time, however, Thoreau finds that a vegetal faculty inside of himself, a capacity to receive, absorb, and what he calls to store up influences, and to nod like the rye heads in the breeze, grain, rye. His capacity to act like the rye heads, he's just nodding in the hot and sticky weather. His vegetal capacity comes to the fore as his cognitive capacity or faculty goes to the background. Here's the passage that I took that from. You must walk so gently as to hear the finest sounds. That's a kind of doting, perhaps, right? The faculties being in repose. Your mind must not perspire. True. Out of doors, my thought is commonly drowned, as it were, and shrunken. My thought, pressed down by stupendous piles of light ethereal influence. For the pressure of the atmosphere is still 15 pounds to a square inch. I can do little more than preserve the equilibrium and resist the pressure of the atmosphere. I can only nod like the rye heads in the breeze. I expand more surely in my chamber, back in his house, as far as expression goes, as if that pressure were taken off. But here outdoors is the place to store up influences. So there's nodding like the rye heads in the breeze. Okay, now if ontography consists in procedures that grasp, open up, and register the ontic reality without being conveyed by language or perhaps even the conceptual, I'm quoting from Lorenz Engel, then the New England scene described here, that New England scene includes at least two efforts of ontographic inscription or material agency. The first is the impress of the atmosphere, that brew of summer sun, heat, humidity, dust, pollen, sweat, breeze, and the buzzing sound of insects. And this led me to think a little bit about insect life. And Hugh Raffles wrote a book called Insectopedia. He's an anthropologist, really interesting book. And from that I learned that if you take a half-mile wide column of air going up 14,000 feet, in the northern hemisphere, in there turns out to be 3 billion insects, each all doing their things, making this background hum. And so what I want to sort of point out is, if you think about ontography as non-human or more than human or other than human forms of impress, and you really pay attention to all this stuff, there's a lot going on right here. This living atmosphere, consisting of all these and many other shapes, sounds, and movements, it exerts itself on sensitive flesh. And that's what I think Thoreau is getting at here. Now, flesh itself is a second mode of ontographic effort or inscription. It transmits the impressions received from the atmosphere to Thoreau qua organism, to the effect that the atmosphere now remanifests as a kind of mental fog in Thoreau. That is, as the specific bodily comportment, posture, and rhythm that is nodding. I can only nod like the ryeheads in the breeze. Atmosphere grafts himself onto the man and the plant. The plants are waving too. It evinces itself by inducing nodding in Thoreau and in the ryeheads. The atmosphere's act is perhaps best described as an induction more than a construction or constitution or production. It's an induction. Why an induction? Because it relies on the tendencies and properties of the already there materials of the flesh and the grain, the plant. Flesh and grain are, for example, permeable and sensitive to wind, heat, moisture. If they were not, they wouldn't be, you wouldn't be able to induce nodding in them. And they also have the sort of structural possibility of standing upright. I have that, the stalks of grain have it. And they also have moving parts that are capable of the movement style known as nodding or bobbing. So what is at work on the scene, I would say, is a distributed kind of agency that requires active participation from both the giver and the receiver, or the giver and the receiver. It is an inducing, an inflecting, an invoking. What is more, because the efforts that make up the act are multiple and multi-specied, it's quite impossible to identify the first cause of the process that results in nodding. The effect, let's say the effect is nodding. It's impossible to name what was the cause and what was the effect, really. Did the nod come from Thoreau? Well, he's out there nodding, like the ryeheads in the breeze. Did the nod come from him? Or was it the effect of a prompt from without? Was he prompted, right? Was the nod initiated by the atmosphere? Or is the atmosphere but a complement to a tendency already underway within the affective bodies of man and rye? Okay, so after Thoreau goes back inside his hut, his homemade house, his power of thought, we are told, again comes to the fore. I'll repeat what he wrote. I expand more surely in my chamber as far as expression goes. So stuff comes in, and it reconfigures his mental and his faculties, and then the expression can happen after he goes indoors. He's now able to write up the recent happenings as a scene, as a dramatic scene of cognitive suspension and vegetal nod activation. In his chamber, atmospheres and bodily postures recompose as meaning-filled squiggles on the page, as writing, in his journal, which we quote, over here. Thoreau describes this as speaking a word for nature, where nature names those bodies and forces whose efficacy is not, in the first instance, linguistic. By way of the efforts, a whole kind of assemblage of the efforts of thought, of memories, of the motor intentionality of fingers and forearms as he writes, also by way of the leanings of pencil, ink, paper, cooler air, and less glaring light of his chamber, the messy assemblage becomes journal entry. I'll just say as an aside that, Thoreau was an inveterate walker. He took a walk every day, and long walks every day, pretty much used up the whole day walking. And he also took notes on plants when they flower. He had very detailed botanical recordings. And he actually invented a portable pencil in order to do it. His family was in the pencil-making business, and he invented a pencil so that he could do it, so he doesn't have to carry around like a pen with ink, Okay. So, by way of the efforts of thoughts, memories, the motor intentionality of fingers and forearms, by way of the leanings of the pencil, ink, paper, the cooler air and less glaring light of his chamber, the messy assemblage becomes a journal entry. The journal entry resonates with, but also adds something to an ongoing tune. Thoreau's literary output is a riff, one could say, on a self-expressive outdoors. Thoreau allows theorizing, and now I quote again from the Theory Adrift piece, Thoreau allows theorizing to be initiated by the direct encounters with a tactile and unsorted world rather than by cleansed representations. That's how one might put the point. Okay, and this, that reminded me of this. This is just, I'm sure you all might have versions of this, where this was not like this was just a notebook of something, at some conference. And it's not, like for Thoreau, there was the outside, that would be the outside, and then it prompted the journal entry. But in my case here, I was writing the notes of what people were saying, and that prompted me to describe it on the left side, yeah. But just, I want to sort of enter into our room here, the relationship between outside, imagery, drawings, and writings, all different forms of expression. Okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to do with that passage from Thoreau's Walking. Let me turn to the second kind of walk, and that's the walk of a line, not of a human body, but of a graphic line. All right, I'll repeat the inspirational line from Paul Klee: an active line moving freely goes for a stroll on its own without destination. As an inveterate doodler, I'm familiar with strolling lines. They flow down arm, fingers, pencil, out the graphite tip, joining and diverging from trajectories already taken by their predecessors on the page. The lines saunter, curve, loop, zigzag, double back to the east, north, south, west, and eventually come to a rest, sometimes after a walk that's brisk, and sometimes after one more lazy. Doodles are rarely, in my case, born out of doors. More often they emerge in a chamber, a room, where something else is the official site of attention, like a meeting or a lecture. Maybe you're doodling right now. A phone conversation while you're waiting for the check in the restaurant if you're by yourself. Doodles don't need a lot of space. They make landfall on a margin of a text, corner of a napkin, upside down is fine. Though, as Klee notes, they do like to roam around. Now, I feel confident that their strolling shapes are something other than or in excess of the expression of my intentions. So in the act of doodling, I don't experience myself fully as an intentional actor. They're not intentions. They don't come from, neither are they the output of a drive, or they don't seem to be mine 100%. Even more than the less absent-minded works called drawings or paintings, doodles tend to surprise the one who's holding the pencil. You don't know what's going to come out. Lo, a shape, I say to myself, quoting Walt Whitman, as they emerge on the page. Doodles do not have, in short, the same sort of prideful feel as, say, when I put a diagram on the blackboard for my students because I'm trying to outline the logic of some philosophical text I've assigned them. That I feel like is more mine. Or when I make a chart to operationalize a plan that I like travel plans or something. That has a different feel of ownership. Though, again, not fully my own, but I'm drawn to the phenomenon of doodling because it engenders in me, it gets me more in touch with a distributed kind of agency or efficacy that I participate in. Yeah. Now, more faithful to the phenomenology of doodling would be the assertion of an efficacy that's ontologically multiple, variegated, distributed across a broad field. There's a wonderful book called Line Let Loose by David McLaughlin. It's a book on doodling, this sort of theory of doodling, and he takes a step towards this idea of a distributed kind of efficacy when he invokes the agency of, quote, the drawing process itself, whose kinetic energy, the, quote, to and fro of the pencil, is such that a doodler watches her hand as if it belonged to someone else. That's a quote. Now, Deleuze and Guattari might say here that the doodle follows the rules of a proto-geometry, and they take that notion from Husserl. A proto-geometry concerns itself, they say, not with the established shapes known to geometry, like a cone, a parallelogram, a sphere, etc., but with forms that are intrinsically inexact, vague, vagabond, nomadic. And so this talks about maybe these shapes that come out are following the rules of a proto-geometry, I don't know, that Deleuze and Guattari talk about. Now, the surrealists, influenced by emerging discourses of psychoanalysis, like we're talking the teens, 19 teens, took the non-intentionality of doodling to suggest that doodles expressed an obscure region of the human psyche called the unconscious, or what Carl Jung called, quote, the unfathomable dark recesses of the conscious mind and its wealth of subliminal perceptions. Another surrealist, Max Maurice, described doodles as, quote, spontaneous images prompted by imperceptible undulations of the flux of thought, end quote. Now, you probably know surrealist games of automatic writing, such as the Exquisite Corpse, were designed to unearth the secrets of the unconscious. They rendered more perceptible these undulations. Here's a famous cadaver exquisite. It's a collectively made drawing. You know how you do it? It's like you take a piece of paper, you draw a little thing, you fold it over, the next person can't see it, they draw something, but a little bit of the old drawing is shown up on the folded over part. They make another thing, it's a collective, it's like an unconscious drawing collectively made, and here's one of those. All right, so this is a theory of doodling or automatic drawing, which comes from a psychoanalytic tradition where the activity is kind of psychic, and I'm trying to think about doodling as not so much a psychic thing, even an interpsychic, but a kind of atmospheric, human, non-human practice, yeah. Okay, so there's no doubt that the figure of an inner unconscious flux has had a lot of explanatory, not to mention therapeutic power, but that framework doesn't capture well the doodler's sense, I think, of the presencing of a creative flux that's outside, right? That's not in us wholly. A creative flux that exceeds intra and interpsychic relations, which operates, Thoreau might say, out of doors. The anthropocentrism of surrealism makes it difficult to detect and acknowledge contributions made, by example, by Concord's, the town of Concord, Massachusetts, the ahuman atmosphere. Now, in contrast, the various 19th century spiritualist or mediumistic forms of artistic automatism, later to be absorbed into discourses in art, such as psychotic art or outsider art, that was happening around the same time, a little bit earlier than when the surrealists were working. They did try to name, as Thoreau did, sort of outside influences. The medium, the seance. The drawing hand of a usually female medium at a seance was claimed to be guided exclusively by these atmospheric forces, right, or spirits. Now, most such claims were eventually revealed to actually have involved some human intentionality, but that fact need not invalidate the intuition that motivated the practices of seance, automatic drawing, or other rituals of aesthetic possession, i.e., the sense that more than human forces of creativity are active and real. Okay. Now, had McLaughlin, who wrote the book Line Let Loose, his study of doodles, had he attended more closely to this sort of outside reverberations, forces, vibrations, object presencings, if he had attended to that more closely, perhaps by way of the figure of a virtual realm that is real despite not being fully actual, that would be a Deleuzian vocabulary, or if he had invoked the figure of creative evolution in the way that Henri Bergson does, or if he invoked the figure of ethereal yet efficacious natural influences in the way that Thoreau did, then he might have spared himself, I think, the either-or question that organizes his study of doodles. And that either-or question is this: is doodling automatic or is doodling intentional? The either-or question is a precipitate, I think, of a grammar of active subjects and relatively passive objects. It also tends to revert to the notion that artistry is itself an exclusively human power, that only people can be artistic, but no other systems or practices. But if instead bodies of many different sorts are presumed to be capable of these kind of artistic, creative, ontographic operations, then other questions concerning doodling might be able to come to the foreground. Instead of, for example, this question: which of the human faculties produce and direct doodling? That's the way doodling is, to the extent that it's theorized, that's one of the guiding questions. How about this question? How does doodling help us to rethink our sovereign-centric model of action, of what it means to act? The doodle, one could say, I'm saying, bears witness to outdoor forces that have seeped in and to the distributive, conjoint quality of action itself. A messy swarm of outdoor elements activates a drawing process which leans into the momentum of the strolling line, which has its own kind of mild autonomy, which taps the shoulder of the human doodler who lends her arm to the pencil, which gives the nod to the emergent shapes. And you could do that sequence with any one of those elements in the first place, second, you can mix them all around. Okay, so let me turn to the last part of my talk, which is that productive paradox of writing up or writing about non-human or more than human or ahuman or ontographic operations that include the ahuman and the alinguistic. How do you write? We talked a little bit about this at the brunch this morning. How it's a paradox, maybe a paradise. How do you write up that which is not, whose first language, let us say, is not linguistic, or whose first mode of expression is not linguistic? What are the characteristics of a rhetorical style that is least distorting? What grammar, syntax, tropes, tricks are most pertinent? How to speak a word for this? Thoreau's writing, which hovers between genres, it's got some botanical close description. He's a little bit of a political theorizer. He's a little bit of a myth maker. He's a poet. Everyone thinks he's a bad poet, but he's a poet. All of those genres, the mix of them, help perhaps to make him very good at acknowledging the contributions made by forces to the writing, made by forces whose first language is not human. Thoreau writes up his encounters in ways that mark how the not-quite-human vitalities prompt his written texts and continue to inform and deform his texts each time they are read. So let me give you an example of that. Here's how he describes what he tries to do. He says, I want to write as the scribe of the corn and the grass and the atmosphere writing. So he wants to write as the scribe of practices of writing that are already ongoing. Okay, I want to write as the scribe of the corn and the grass and the atmosphere writing. That's the end quote. And he wants to insinuate into the reader an uncanny sense that at the very moment of one's writing, one is amidst a bevy of active forces, some human, many of them not. Now, a poetics appropriate to this more than human kind of agency might try then to acknowledge and to dramatize how the metaphors one uses remain infused and fueled by the physical forces more obviously at work when one is out in the sun on a really hot day. Such writing could show, for example, how the throat and chest feeling of breathing and the texture of wind on your face still vibrate inside the word inspiration. Okay, there's breathing, you inspire and respire. So the metaphor of inspiration is still fueled and activated by the throat and chest feeling of breathing and the texture of the wind on your face. That's still present in the it's much more than metaphor, right? It's active, right? Or you might try to write in a way where you recognize that when you use the phrase on the one hand and on the other hand, that induces a subtle rocking to and fro of your body, like, you know, hula hooping. I was reading some cognitive psychology and neurobiology studies of how to speak certain phrases has a bodily effect, even when you wouldn't think of it. And it turns out that when you say on the one hand, on the other hand, even if you're not obviously going like this, they measure it, you know, very subtle moves. You move a little to the left, you know, you go like that. It's like your little hula hoop while you're saying that. So, I mean, just to sort of pay attention to the way those words have a kind of physicality to them in your own body. So such a rhetoric might also push the metaphorical to the point where it becomes uncertain whether a sentence speaks in a descriptive or an aspirational voice, and also uncertain whether the speaker is positioned above the scene or as a body swimming in a processual sea. You know, the objective or the subject, I suppose. Such a rhetoric would also try to and now I'm paraphrasing something Michel Foucault said, to bring sentences to life, showing not only how sentences express the humanist societal life of its writer, but also press forward a vitality proper to ahuman shapes that were part of the human's experience. Such a sentence, says Foucault, would, quote, light fires, watch the grass grow, listen to the wind, and catch the sea foam in the breeze and scatter it, end quote. They would acknowledge what Thoreau calls natural influences and how they linger in the language that is enlivened by them. Whitman, too, sought such a poetics, and he described it as, I want a poetics that's, quote, done with reviews and criticisms of life, and instead animating now to life itself. So the writer was not to be a critic or a objective, a person or a body not also in the process, right? So he wants to be animating now to life itself. To animate to life is to throw oneself heartily into an ongoing creative process. It is neither to take a decisive action, as in to say, to act more animatedly, nor is it to endure as a patient of an outside force, as when Frankenstein's monster is animated by electricity. So it's neither passive nor active. And Thoreau makes a similar point in another book he wrote called A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers about a healthy sentence. Here's his description. A perfectly healthy sentence, it is true, is extremely rare. It is as if a green bough were laid across the page and we are refreshed by the sight of fresh grass in midwinter or early spring. You have constantly the warrant of life and experience in what you read. The little that is said is eked out by implication of the much that was done. Good sentence. The sentences are verdurous and blooming as evergreen and flowers because they are rooted in fact and experience. Now, such a rhetoric might also try to speak with a tongue that's ramified or many-branched, like a huge old oak tree or a neural network, or perhaps with a voice that is rhizomatic in the sense of being all branches and no trunk, and that's, of course, again from Deleuze and Guattari. And I like this line at the beginning of at the beginning of 1,000 Plateaus. They write, "The two of us wrote Anti-Oedipus together. Since each of us was several, there was already quite a crowd." Okay. Such a rhetoric would be roomy enough to accommodate a heterogeneous swirl of agents, some human, some not. It would try to find workarounds to the grammar of subjects and objects in order to display how writing up consists in overlapping waves of expressive effort, some mine, some yours, and some apersonal. Okay, now, all of that is just aspirational. What would such a rhetoric have to do? Those are the things I've been saying, but how? How do you do that? So I want to talk about one technique, it's not even a technique, one writing style. It's to bespeak within an ongoing process. That's the poetics or the rhetoric, is to try to find a language so that you bespeak of things that are not you, but partly you and running through you, to bespeak, and I like the verb bespeak. It's an old-fashioned verb, but it's a good one to get at this idea. To bespeak from within an ongoing process rather than from an external vantage point where the subject of a predicate either directs activity in the active voice or is acted upon in the passive voice. That's precisely what verbs in the middle voice do. And I want to talk a little bit about middle-voiced verbs at the end, and then I'm done. The middle voice is a grammatical form appropriate to, prompted by, and traversed by what Thoreau called stupendous ethereal influences. Now, middle-voiced verbs are marked formally in classical Greek and Sanskrit, but they're not marked formally in English. I don't know, maybe Icelandic, I don't know if there's a middle voice. But in English, there is no formal voice called the middle voice. The middle voice distinguishes a mode of action whose prompts come from multiple sources and whose efficacy is the function not of a discrete agent or agency, but of a complex recursive process. Now, it's not marked formally in English, but I'm going to give some examples of approximations of it in a moment. But first, let me give you the sort of linguist description of the middle voice. Okay, so I'll say it again. The middle voice distinguishes a mode of action whose prompts come from multiple sources, whose efficacy is the function not of a discrete agent or agency, but of a complex recursive process. According to this one linguist who's written a lot on the middle voice, the dominance of two voices, active and passive, was a relatively late development of the Indo-European verb form. It was a transformation of an older, prior linguistic order in which the key difference was between activities in which an actor stands outside the activity and thus not changed by it, and that's called external diathesis, on the one hand, and activities in which an actor is inside and thus subject to being altered by the process as one describes it, right? That's called internal diathesis. Internal diathesis, the internal, right, it would only later be presented as midway between active and conditional verbal forms. The middle of middle-voiced verbs, then, is not a mean between active and passive, despite its word, middle. It indicates instead an effectivity amidst a complex, heterogeneous atmospheric process. Any acting I, when described in the middle voice verb, affects while being affected in amidst. Now, linguists emphasize repeatedly as you read this stuff how hard it is to theorize the middle voice in a language like English, which has almost entirely eradicated it, and sort of in favor of the passive and the active. The sheer difficulty and awkwardness of attempts to do so reminds us of the power of grammar to circumscribe what can be felt of life. But I want to emphasize, however, that this circumscription is not complete. Linguistic forms that do nod to a distributive kind of agency still persist in English, and they can be amplified through practices of writing up, which is something I think Thoreau and poets, the poet Whitman, tend to do. Take, for example, Whitman's phrase, "I sing the body electric." It's famous from a poem with the same title, "I sing the body electric." Now, in that phrase, "I sing the body electric," there's an I, but the I is enmeshed in a process with flesh, electricity, and sound. And if there is any choosing to sing on the part of the I or the poet, that choosing is best understood as a kind of passage through an intermediate state of cohesion, a sense of apprehending a presence, so that only in a rather indirect way is one active or choosing. Or consider another middle-voiced phrase from Whitman, this one. Oh, no, that's rhizomatic speech. This is another, it's the phrase, "It sails me, I dab with bare feet." I hear the trained soprano, "What work with hers is this? The orchestra whirls me wider than Uranus flies. It wrenches such ardors from me, I did not know I possessed them. It sails me, I dab with bare feet." Now, "it sails me," that's an interesting phrase. Okay, again, middle-voiced. Am I being sailed? Am I sailing? It sails me, right? Or take these more everyday examples of middle-voiced phrases. And It sounds good. Is there is that passive or active? Or, and a lot of middle-voiced formulations show up in American Black English, like, I be going now. I be going now? It's like there's an ongoing goingness, and I be going now with it, right? Both of those phrases, it sounds good, or I be going now, both of these are responses to happenings in which the speaker remains currently entangled. The act named is less an intervention by a discrete self into a background environment than a movement within and by virtue of a heterogeneous, lively atmosphere. Now, all this suggests, and this is my last paragraph, that a rhetoric this is just, I'm trying this out, I'm not sure this works, but a rhetoric may be appropriate for a kind of compositional or composted agency with things, would be sprinkled liberally with these sort of process-oriented verbs: to induce, to animate, to inflect, to partake, to sing, to sound. Such verbs mark activities with multiple loci of impetus, and they position partakers as already caught up in an ongoing flow that precedes them, into which they may add something: impetus, drag, swerve. So it's not like you don't add anything, but then again, you don't, like the middle-voiced verbs are like the opposite of the model of action that I think of because I'm teaching ancient political thought. So we're reading Aeschylus, and there's Zeus shows up. And Zeus is like the opposite of the middle-voiced verbed actor. He's outside the scene, he's in the clouds, and when he acts, he just throws the thunderbolt. And he's untouched by it. Turns out he actually gets touched by it, but it takes eons. He throws the thunderbolt in. That's like the sort of sovereign model of agency, the opposite of this middle-voiced kind of thing. All right, so a rhetoric for compositional or composted agency would be sprinkled liberally with process-oriented middle-voiced verbs: to induce, to animate, to partake, to sing, to sound. They mark activities with multiple loci of impetus, and they position human partakers, as already caught up in an ongoing flow that precedes them and to which they may add impetus, drag, or swerve. Such verbs position human participants as always already involved in a creative flow before it's possible to feel oneself being so, before one can take action. We are middle-voiced partakers even more than actors or recipients. Language can never be wholly faithful to influences not linguistic. Every rhetoric, poetics, or wordy composition will be more or less untrue to stupendous ethereal influences that signal without words. But writing them up remains one powerful way to get in touch with them. Drawing, singing, dancing, other ways as well. But writing them up remains one of those powerful ways to get in touch with these outside influences, however crookedly or off-key. The question of a rhetoric opposite to a middling, more than human creative process is a daunting one. Like the neo-vitalist, neo-materialist, assemblage-focused, and non-human turns in scholarship that have made it possible to define this even as a task, discussion of how to use words with things are still fledgling, but we be trying. Okay, thank you.